I grew up in Kansas, and there's not much of an industry for animation in Kansas, although there's a lot of history to it.
Oh.
That's where Walt Disney started, and several Friz Freleng was there, and Ub Iwerks was there. So actually, I think Harmon and Ising were there for a time as well. So it's interesting that there's a lot of history there, but there's really no industry to it.
Yeah.
Everybody was there and they left. I grew up in a town called Leavenworth, which is known for its prisons. That's really what it's known for. But I basically grew up in the countryside. We grew up on a farm, and so it's basically farmland. It's about 40 minutes away from Kansas City. So. But I was just the kid that never was interested in farming. I was always interested in drawing. So I have vivid memories of being 3 years old, and my dad bring me paper home to draw on, and it was actually tracing paper. And I remember drawing on the separate sheets of paper and looking and flipping back and forth between the pages. And obviously flip books are a very primitive form of animation, but after the first time I drew on several pages, I could see that I could see through it. And seeing it, I was like, wow, this is interesting. Even at a young age, it's like I could see that there was a difference. And it's not like the drawings were connected to one another, but just seeing the different drawings and the different layers, I could see that if you moved it like that, the drawing started to move around. It wasn't even really till later that I realized that that's kind of what I would be doing as an animator.
That's amazing.
But it was just interesting because my dad he brought home this tracing paper, and it was actually yellow for some reason. I never understood why it was yellow, but somewhere I've still got those yellow pads of paper with drawings on them. But yeah, it was just something about drawing, and I had red pencils for some reason too, which is what you end up doing for the most part in 2D animation. You get these red color erase pencils.
I'll be darned.
So, but it was something that made me starting to think about movement as opposed to just static drawings.
After finishing high school in Evanston, Illinois, I got on the bus. It took 3 days then, and came to Los Angeles with one piece of paper in my hand, which gave me 2 addresses. The first address that I looked up was the place that in every city has when they have a problem and too many people in the city and people want to come in. They tell you, why don't you go back where you came from? We'll give you the car, pay. So this place said, you're a young kid, you just out of high school. Why don't we pay you, go back to Evanston, Illinois? Well, that was the first reception that I had after this piece of paper that I got from one of my teachers. But anyway, then I had one more piece of paper with me with an address that the teacher gave me. So I went to see them, and he was the head of a bank downtown Los Angeles. And the best thing I could do with him, he gave me $20 because he wanted to help me as a poor student, And so, but then he also gave me an address of a painter. Well, I wasn't that happy with painters, but anyway, I had no choice. So I got up to Hollywood and Wine someplace, and there was a painter painting on the corner. Well, that just sent me way up high because, that was the one thing I really hated, these painters who are out there in the nature and in the copy nature. Anyway.
But excuse me, why were painters something you didn't like?
Because I didn't care for them, really. And
what reason, though?
The reason was that I was not really involved in painting landscapes. That was never in my agenda. Anyway, we got to know each other. And lo and behold, he knew some people at this animation studio, where they do black and white kind of weird characters, So he took me over there and introduced me to the man who owns the studio and all that. And they gave me a job. I think it was $15 a week. Charles means studio. So that's where I got my job after being in Hollywood for about 3 weeks because of this painter that I so disliked at the beginning.
When I was still in my crib, my mother smelled something funny from my room, And she came in and she saw that I had reached into the depths of my diaper, and with the coloring matter that I could find, I was drawing on the wall over my crib. So at once, my mother discovered, A, that I was left-handed, and 2, that I must be an artist. And I guess I've been drawing pictures ever since.
Yeah, when Bob left Warner Brothers, which was Leon Schlesinger's, it was Warner Brothers then actually, Bob brought me along to what was Industrial Films. As I was the office boy at Warner Brothers, to become the office boy at Industrial Films. At the same time, they were taking me to Don Graham's Monday night professional drawing class at Chenard Art Institute. Chuck Jones and Bob Cannon and Seamus Culhane, and learning to draw, and I was in high school. And I left and became New Industrial, of which time they changed their name to United Productions of America, since at that time I recall they couldn't think of any better thing to call it. And nobody understood why on that. And so Industrial Films, which was in the old Otto K. Olson building on Vine Street, between Sunset and Hollywood Boulevard. During that time, I learned, started to in-between, finish high school, and go to Chenard Art Institute.
I was, as a kid, I used to draw all the time. Then I went to college and I took art. All they taught you there was the spectrum, you know. They went in for more of the fine arts, but I didn't care. I wanted cartooning. So I took the C.N. Landon course, which is a course from Cleveland. It's a correspondence. That's how I was so interested in artwork, that cartooning, that in animation more than just the cartooning. I was driving a truck. I had earned a living, and they paid $14 a week to drive this truck. And I stopped at Santa Monica Boulevard, and Gil Turner, a fellow that later became a very good friend of mine, asked me to come upstairs and see what they're doing. They were doing Moon Mullins. So I went upstairs and I saw what I liked. So I said, can I learn how to do this? I worked for 2 weeks without pay or anything. My father was furious that I quit a $14 a week job, because those is depression time. And I said, no, this is what I want to do in the future. So after 2 weeks, I went out to, we saw an ad in the paper, wanted in-betweeners of iWork Studio. We went out there, and that's where I met Steve Bazzusto, and I got a job through Grim Natwig as a in-betweener at that time. And then I worked for a while, about a couple months, I can't remember exactly. He advanced me to an assistant, which was much more pay. Then my father thought, oh, it was wonderful after that.
You started out at Van Buren, like...
I worked there as, you know, I started out there in 1931.
31?
Washing cells, right from the bottom. From there, the in-betweener, the assistant, then animator. I left in 1935. Came here to California. On the way here, I stopped off at different schools, and until I found the one I liked out here in Glendale, which was Curtis Wright Technical Institute, where I got an engineering degree.
Before you leave Van Buren, you were telling me about the Toonerville trolley.
Oh, yeah. It was in 1935 that we got the rights, or the studio did, got the rights to animate it. And Bert Gillette was the director on it, I think. And, or Ted Ashbole, I forget. And that's where I worked at it. And it was, I left the studio before the film was finished.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work in it. And I came out here to the UCLA, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago? Must have been, huh?
Right.
And that was the first film they ran. And I remember then I'd worked on it, and that's the first time I'd seen it in all those years. And it was pretty much up to date. It illustrated the comic strip very faithfully.
How different was it working back in the 30s?
No different than it was later on.
Really?
Other than they had the standard in a studio. They have the standard category of people, and at the end of the world that was different. Eventually, toward the end, was freelancing, where you could do everything yourself, not bother with assistants and in-betweeners, which were, to me, it slowed me down literally,
Right.
because I would have to correct their work a little bit here and there, and it took me longer to do things with them. So time was precious, so I did it all myself, and I got more finesse into it than you normally can. People think down lowly, the lowly in-betweener, it's between 2 points, everything. Well, it's not so. There's a lot of things you can do in between there with those few seconds, or those frames, I mean,
Right.
that you can make a lot more strong or softer or whatever you want to do, even in an expression. So I found freelancing gave me a lot of liberties I wouldn't have had in the studio.
Like every kid who loved to draw, it was always a pleasure. And my art teachers all said, "Barry, when you grow up, you should be an artist." I said, "Okay." And so I should have worked harder at it, because there's a lot of things that I could have practiced and practiced. But I ended up going to art school at the University of Manitoba and that was a great school. I mean, it's a legendary time. In the early 50s, they changed the art school into you can get a degree at the college, and they brought in some wonderful professors from the States, and not all from the States, but very well trained, and God, I mean, really very talented guys. Most of them quite young, because they were just trying to earn a living while they painted for a living. And all I knew is I wanted to be an artist. I didn't know what kind of artist. And when I graduated, all the professors made a little semicircle, and they're all sitting there, "Oh, Barry, you graduated now, and we think that you should become a teach and paint." Teach and paint, okay. So I became an animator.
I guess like everyone else, your parents taking you to animated films, and for me this was during the 1940s, mostly the late 40s, early 50s, and I'd discuss a little bit, I'm sure, with the other kids what character was neat. I saw all the Disney films, I liked Bugs Bunny, and I didn't think anything special about it, just thought that was part of growing up, seeing cartoons. One Sunday afternoon, we had a little television, small television, and there were the morning shows on Saturday that were starting to show cartoons, mostly still running the old ones from the silent eras and early sounds. But then came on a Sunday afternoon, a little half-hour show, very contemporary, different looking animation that I've ever seen, and different stories too. And that planted a little seed in my mind that that's something you can do with animation. I don't know if I even articulated it that way.
Do you remember what the show was?
Yes, it was a UPA Sunday show.
Oh.
Yeah. Came on before Omnibus or something like that, which was another great show. But I didn't think much about animation, except that my mother and my uncle noticed that I could draw better than I could do anything else. So they signed me up for some watercolor classes on Saturday, and I would go out. And so I started to get a little ahead of the game because of these Saturday classes.
My father, I want to begin with him. My father was a still photographer, still is. He's a pretty well-known photographer, and he worked for Look magazine. And growing up, I think I leaned towards the visual side of things, as did my dad. And so as a child, even with my dad, there was a lot of drawing going on. And also, I'm part of the generation that grew up with television. And because of television, they were rerunning a lot of cartoons and movies like the original King Kong on television, and that had all a big impact on me as a boy. And I also say it was because I was a failed musician. My mom had insisted that my sisters and I take piano lessons, and I didn't do too well with piano, and then she tried me with guitar. I didn't do too well with guitar. And finally, she knew I liked to draw. She says, well, if you're not going to do any music, I'm going to put you in drawing classes. It was an extracurricular thing. And to me, that was pure pleasure. And I had teachers who would sit me down with a stick of charcoal and an easel and a pad, and they'd set up a still life. And I had one teacher who said, now I'm going to go away for an hour, and I'm going to come back, and you just try to copy what's in front of you. And she came back, my mom came back, she left, and they both stood there with their jaws open going, oh my God, look at that, the composition's right, the values are correct. And it somehow was, it came easy for me. So,
how old were you at this time?
Gee, I think 10.
Actually, I used to say that my generation in Brazil was the first generation that had a television set in the living room. So I was used when I was a kid to watch the black and white cartoons, silent ones or not dubbed as we use in Brazilian television, based on action like Tom and Jerry or Woody Woodpecker, and we're the first generation of kids that were exposed to this mass of animation language.
So presumably there were no Brazilian animators in those days?
No. Yeah, some little spots, some commercials, but not very, very extraordinary things. And I think that gave us the urge to try to respond to that information, like to try to make our films. And that's my case. I started doing some comics, and then I wanted my comics to move, and I wanted to some way film it and make cartoons. And it started like that. When I was 15, I bought a Super 8 camera, and I shot my first animated film.
I loved to do animation, but there was no place to study it. And the only way, there was no television in Israel, and the only way place you can see it, it's before movies. They had some kind of Mickey Mouse and I wanted to do animation, but so the chance came when the Israeli television started in 1969.
So television didn't start till 1969?
Yes.
Okay.
And then I hired as a cartoonist. And then somehow I managed to do some animation, and because nobody understood anything, everything I did, every experiment went on air, and people like it. It was so primitive, but nice ideas. And after years, I worked on a satire program, which called Nikui Rosh, Cleaning the Head, and I did anything I wanted, like spots of 20 seconds, 15. The longest one was 50 seconds, And every show, which was every 2 weeks, I did like 3-4 pieces of it, very fast. And when it finished, I made a collection, and I just got some scholarship from the American Cultural Foundation to visit studios in North America, 6 weeks. So I came for 6 weeks, and I stayed 6 years. Because then
was that all with the National Library of Canada?
No, I started with what happened when you say I'm an animator from Israel, it sounds like I'm an expert for diet from Biafra or something like that. Animation in Israel. Anyway, it was, when I showed it, people liked it because it was the primitive animation, but it was nice ideas. And so at the beginning, I worked at the CBC in Toronto. And then I started with the film board.
Well, I guess I was, your typical school book doodler, which is how I started drawing. I was drawing little comic books for my friends and stuff like that. As I went through life, I realized what I wanted to do was find some way of telling stories. I didn't much care how those stories were told. I could draw a little bit, and I could write pretty well. And I think my first attempt to get a story out to the public was to do a musical comedy for a college play. That was called Genius is a Four-Letter Word, and that was back in 1966. At that point in my life, I couldn't have cared less whether I became a comic book artist, a playwright, a writer for television, or a songwriter, which was another of my interests, because they all had the same capacity for simply getting a story across in an entertaining way. So animation was kind of arbitrary in a way.
If you work as an illustrator or a freelance artist, you're not very sure when the next pay will come. So for me, animation was perfect in the fact that I would receive, a check every month, and I will then be happy to buy my records and to my clothing and everything else. I actually come from a rather humble family in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And my father was an anarchist. And he's a man who felt that you should do whatever you want to do, as long as you do it with a sense of your own responsibility. And when I finished the primary school, I said to him I didn't want to do secondary school. I said, why not? He said, well, because I'm going to be an animator. I don't want to actually go to college. He said, well, do you really know what you're talking about? I said, yeah. All right. So, but you get a job. So I, at 13, started to work as a delivery boy in a chemist shop. And then because I thought I needed a profession, I went to work in a factory, which was horrible, absolutely horrible. This is very hard. So I didn't have my hands dirty and my clothes messy. So I actually decided I want to be something else. And I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to draw because I knew you could wear a tie when you are actually working as an artist. And the ambition of my life was to wear a tie as I went to work.
Well, I guess it's important to say that I grew up in a very small town in Scotland. My profession is extremely unusual, but I grew up like everyone else, watching Chuck Jones cartoons, except I just didn't stop watching them. I just kept on wanting to draw and watch cartoons. And it's only quite recently that I realised that my early influences are making an impact on my life now. And they were things like British films, Watership Down, When the Wind Blows, quite political films, Pink Floyd, The Wall, Neil Jordan's Company of Wolves, very obscure. I couldn't quite work out where they fit into my life, but more recently it's all coming together and making sense. My dad and my uncle were a great influence on nature, and they were my teachers. They were environmentalists and Greenpeace supporters. So again, that all sort of led into the environmental interest that I have. Both my mum and dad and my sister always supported my artistic ability and tried to push that forward. Interestingly, at school, we were asked to write a list of careers that we want to pursue. And I wrote artist, illustrator. I mean, I didn't really know what an animator or anything was at that time. And they said to me, that's not a career, you have to pick something else.
Yes, I got into animation pretty early. I was, of course, like many of my generation, influenced very much by Disney shorts, and especially Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And then my immediate post-war era was not exactly the place for animation. Conditions were not good after the war financially, and everything was backwards and so on. There was film production, but animation, there had been some before the war, and a bit during the war, but after the war, there hardly anything going on. But I managed to get myself a job at an advertising agency, and they allowed me to make commercials for theaters.
Animated commercials?
Yeah, animated commercials. I did that, you know, without any qualification or anything, just because there's also an advantage to animation not having been developed, is that they don't know that it is difficult, or then they can't do it just like that. And I got to do it, and it was used commercially, professionally, and it was a great school, except my only school was to run down in the theater and watch Disney shorts all the time, or Popeye films.
At this time?
19.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I...
No, but I was 19. And actually, I really had the best job in the world right there.
I was born and raised in Great Britain. I was born into World War II, and went through the traditional British educational system. I had taken a rather excellent design course, fortunately for me, but had no thoughts of getting into film until I was traveling in Canada in the late 50s. And discovered the work of Norman McLaren, the National Film Board, and befriended a couple of young animators there, and set it my sort of goal to try and, create a job for myself, find employment there, which it took me a year to do. And one day I got a call from a pal, and he said, "Someone just quit today. It might be a good time." And Colin Lowe, who still remains a very good friend of mine, was the director, and he offered me a job as a training animator writer at the NFB, and I got a year contract in 1958-59, and it was like heaven on earth. It was like I was 10 feet off the ground.
Growing up, I didn't want to be an animator per se. I did like Disney animation and remember seeing some of the classics like Pinocchio, 101 Dalmatians when they were re-released, and I really enjoyed those. I think more than animation though, live action fantasy films like Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Empire Strikes Back, when they came out, I think it was at the right age to be really impacted by those. I was 8 and 9 years old, and I think more than anything, those were the films that really interested me in movies, and I was old enough too to be aware that there were different artists involved in making those films, from special effects to makeup to set design, and that started me wondering and got me inspired.
I was a student at CalArts, and I approached animation more from the performance aspect. That was my interest, was the performance part, and less the drawing part. And so when I saw Toy Story, I thought, wow, there's some of this that's really amazing, and then there was some of it that you could tell even then was going to get better. And I thought, well, that's an opportunity. And it's because you're not reliant on your drawing ability, your performance was set free. And I thought, well, I'll check this place out. I had a friend, Stephen Gregory, who was already working here, and he says, man, there's nobody up here. I'm bored. You got to come up here so we can hang out. So I went and I checked it out, and it was such a great vibe there. And all the other studios, they were courting students at CalArts and saying, well, we've got these contracts in 4 or 5 years, and if you're lucky, you'll become an animator in 10 and all this stuff. And Pixar was like, oh, no, come on up here. It's, no, there's no contract, and, you're an animator right away. And it just seemed like such a nice place. And I thought, well, these guys are really cool. The people were great. And I thought, so I applied, and thank God they let me in. And I thought, well, they've only made one movie. And because of that, we were pretty much all students. And I thought, well, I'll stay here until they go out of business, which would be after, a couple films, which is what had happened to other studios that had popped up. I thought, well, this would be a great ride. And then I'll try for my dream afterwards, which would be to work at Disney. And of course, Pixar never went out of business. And I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to come here. And so the 11 years went by really fast.
When I was first in high school and they asked me to pick a career, at that time, I, of course, the only thing I wanted to be was an engineer, and preferably a mining engineer, of course. But anyway, an engineer. I thought I'd work somewhere up in Colorado or someplace like that there, doing whatever engineers do when they go up to those places. Anyhow, so I was a math major all through high school, and when I left high school, one of my teachers recommended me to pursue drawing. Again, at the instance of a friend of mine we were working out in the gym in high school, said, why don't you go to a place, there's a place out there in Hyperion who's hiring young artists. And he said to me, you're an artist, go get a job. Well, he didn't know anything, of course. But I thought it was a good idea, so next day I went over to this place to see about getting a job there, and they asked me, where are your samples? Samples? Yes, your drawing samples. We have to see what you can do. Okay, tomorrow, I said. I went home and drew a bunch of samples. When I think about it, what guts I had. Anyhow, so I went home and made a bunch of drawings, so the next day I went back to the same place and showed them my samples. And you know what they said? How dare they? They said, well, you obviously have some talent, but you have no training at all. However, they said, we can use you as an errand boy or something if you're at least you're sensitive to art. And that's how I started at Walt Disney Productions. Can you imagine the luck of a crazy Mexican like me finding the first job to get is over at Walt Disney Productions? Ha ha! Oh, golly.
This song, Cruella de Vil, from a picture, 101 Dalmatians. Walt Disney gave me the assignment. And I told the writer of the show, Bill Peet, that I didn't care for that title. It's such a made-up crude title, Cruel Devil, Cruella de Vil. I said, but I'll write it. Well, in the elevator, I was in the elevator with Walt Disney himself, and he said, I understand you don't like the title. I said, I thought it was contrived, but I'm going to write the song, don't worry, I'll write it. Well, matter of fact, I wrote 2 songs about Cruella de Vil, and I was ready to go in the studio to play them, and suddenly I realized I was awful early, and it doesn't take long to get to the studio. So I sat down and wrote Cruella de Vil, the one that became so famous. And that's the one Walt liked better than the other ones that I spent weeks on. And this song is one of my biggest money makers. So is the 101 Dalmatians. Cruella de Vil, Cruella de Vil. She doesn't scare you, no evil thing will. To see her is to take a sudden chill. Cruella, Cruella de Vil. Cruella, Cruella de Vil. And that's the one Walt liked. That's the one that was used in the picture. And that's the one I pay the rent.
When I left school at the University of Wisconsin, I decided I was going to either go to California for animation or come to New York for comic books. And I always loved comic books, so I decided, and I had relatives in New York, so I said, I'm comfortable in New York, I'll come to New York and look into comic books. Well, after finding out what was going on in the comic book industry in the late 70s, it was pretty dead end, and I just started taking my portfolio around, and I found out that there was animation going on in New York, which I didn't know. I saw a guy at PBS here, Channel 13 in New York, and he gave me the name of R.O. Bleckman, R. Greenberg, who had a studio that did visual effects, and a guy named Tony Eastman. And I hooked up with all three of them, but Tony is the one who I really hit it off with, and he started feeding me work that he had already done just to see what my capabilities were, and I ended up assisting him on some projects, and Tony's the one who kind of filtered me into the industry by hooking me up to a studio named Perpetual Motion, and so I kind of cut my teeth on things like the Berenstain Bears and Strawberry Shortcake and all this terrible stuff. But it did also put me in the environment with animators who'd been around since the 30s, and I was as happy as could be.
Well, sure. Just briefly, I worked at Disney out of school. I went to CalArts back in the 70s and started in the Disney training program, and worked from being a trainee in animation to an assistant animator for a brief period of time, and then into the story department, and then into design after that. I was known for a character designer for a period of time. And then after that, I worked my way up into art direction and production design.
Actually, I got into fine arts. I went to Michigan State College. I was in the service, and when I got out, I had the GI Bill. And so I went to school there. Actually, I was going to school in California, but I didn't. My friend of mine was already enrolled there, so I went out with him when he was enrolled. I said, well, why not? So I went there, and I took fine arts for 4 years. And while I was there, how I got into cartooning was when I got to be a junior, I was in a Quonset hut with another guy that was a senior, and he was a fine artist too, painting for going to be the next Jackson Pollock or whoever. And but he was a cartoon editor of the Humor magazine. Now, a lot of colleges had humor magazines like Yale Record and the one that made the movie. What was that? The Harvard Lampoon. That was. Yeah, and so anyway, that was what and so he was the editor of it, and so he asked me if I wanted to come over, because when I was in high school, I'd done some kind of cartoons, not many, but a few cartoons, and so I became his assistant editor for that 1 year, and then he graduated, and they made me art director. And the reason I got into cartooning, because they did have cartoons, I would do some, but have students have cartoons, and they would publish cartoons from other magazines. So we were looking at all these humor magazines from all over the country, and we'd use some of those plus the original ones. And also, while I was there, just down the hallway from where they published it, where they did the publishing of the humor magazine, was the campus newspaper. And I also became a political cartoonist on the paper, so I was doing both things. And the political cartoon, I always thought about I kind of wanted to be a political cartoonist, because it was really, and it was at the time of the McCarthy hearings too. So I remember I did a cartoon, and I was against, because they were around nailing everybody, a lot of professors, and but I did one that was really against the, those people that were, well, I forget what they called them, whoever were trying to nail the people.
HUAC, right?
Yeah. And I lived in Lansing. I didn't live at home then, but my dad, I took a newspaper home. My dad, of course, is a very staunch Republican. He says, this is an outrage. And I didn't argue with him. I says, well, that's the way it is. But anyway, that's how I got into cartooning.
And I really always wanted to be an artist. But at the same time, I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to be a brain surgeon, because at the time I was in, as a kid in camp, as you know, in 4 years, the Japanese American was in prison in camp for 4 years in Northern California. And the doctor who was my, the so-called GP, general, was a Japanese, and I liked him. He was my sister's doctor who died of cancer, and leukemia. Yeah. So I said, I want to be a brain surgeon. He was a brain surgeon initially. Yeah. And he was number 3 brain surgeon in all of America. And he was always asked to leave to perform an operation on politicians and rich people, you know, and he refused to. He said, I was put in this camp, you know, as an American citizen, you know, because I'm Japanese, you know, and Japanese. And they said, well, no, it's okay, you can go. We would house you, you don't have to. And he says, no, I won't. He was a man of principle. And he was such an incredible man of principle. I said, I want to be like him. It just impressed me. So anyway, I went after high school and I had a scholarship to go to Stanford University, but I had to make up credit for to get into university, you know. So I had to go to Santa Monica City College, and just about halfway through the 6 months I was there, you know, Mrs. Chenard called me. He said, Jimmy, you must come to this Chenard, and they said you have to make a decision to be an artist or a doctor. You know, I says, I want to be a doctor. I want to be an artist. Because you have a scholarship for 3.5 years to 4 years, whatever length. So anyway.
Could we back up a little bit? What made you change your mind from doctor to artist?
Because I always wanted to be an artist. My father, being Japanese traditional, my mother supported me with whatever I wanted to do, you know. But my father says, art, I mean, he's a first generation Japanese. He didn't know what that meant. Doctor is a profession. To be an artist is not a profession.
I've been interested in animation since I was a young kid. I always wanted to be a cartoonist. And when I saw Disney's Pinocchio, that really influenced me very much. I really wanted to do that. And even though I didn't know what it was that these guys did, I wanted to do that. And I went to an art high school. And while I was there, nobody was teaching animation. They weren't teaching it any place, really, to say much about it. But I decided I was going to focus on animation because I always felt I could get a job in a studio someplace and then decide whether I'm going to do other things in animation or advertising or comic strips or whatever. And we had an advisory board at the school of professionals who oversaw the illustration classes and the photography classes, fashion drawing, and that type of thing. And we also had Paul Terry, who had a animation studio just above New York City in New Rochelle, Terry Toons. They were doing Mighty Mouse and Heckle and Jekyll and that kind of thing. So I had gone out to some studios that were here in Midtown Manhattan. Famous Studios was here, and there were some other little studios beginning to do TV commercials, and some were still doing some theatrical and advertising things. And the teacher got me an interview with Paul Terry, and I got into the Terry Toons within a few weeks out of school.
Then after the war, I ganged up with a few other, and we had a studio of our own. We did commercials. And then the government took away the studio. Then I escaped from Hungary and I went to Paris and I worked in Paris. And I worked first for a filmmaker called Jean Image. He made quite horrible films. And yeah, you know, you must know it. Everybody knows him who knows about rice. Anyway, I worked there, and this is where I learned about UPA in Paris. Yes, and I decided that when I get to New York, I will work for UPA. UPA didn't know that yet. So when I came to New York, I visited the UPA studio. They were so kind, so sweet. I didn't understand anything, but there was a French girl there. So she introduced me, and I was able to ask questions through her. They said they will call me when they need me. And about 2-3 weeks later, so I went up, they called me in, and then suddenly a big man comes out with a big, loud voice, and that was Grim Netwig. And by then I spoke some English, And he asked me, you know what is animation? And I said, yes, animation is animation. And he said, I can't argue with that. So they hired me. And I was working with Grimm for 12 years.
The screen cartoonists had a Halloween party. And Herb asked me if I wanted to come to the Halloween party, but I had to have costume. So I came wearing my two heads from the Spike Jones show, and I won the first prize. So I won the prize, and I met a lot of the people at the studio, a lot of the people in the industry. And it was just natural. I felt so at home with these creative, funny people. So later on, when and they're looking for an addition to the editorial department, well, I had a natural flair for music. I was a musician, so I could work with the musicians. When they needed sound effects, I said, well, I can help you create sound effects. And as far as work with picture, that's something I could learn from them. So that's how it all started.
I was a TV geek when I was a kid. You know, I was born in the 50s, so TV was young. I was a boomer baby, and I would wake up and watch the Test Pattern in the morning. You know, I would wake up and watch the Farm Report. And then those early morning Paul Terry cartoons, they used to run at 7 a.m. in the morning, the ones with zillions of mice running around, and they'd just kind of stick a needle on a record and let the music play until the cartoon was over, and then they'd take the record off. It's Early Bird Cartoons on Channel 7 in New York was the name of the program. And yeah, I would watch that. And shortly thereafter, you know, better cartoons started to come onto the air. So you would see the Fleischer Popeyes and Betty Boops. You would see the first wave of Warner Brothers cartoons that Warner's sold off to AAP up to 1946. So you'd see all the classic Clampett cartoons and things like that. You'd see, you know, some of the MGM cartoons. My real first love was Woody Woodpecker. Not the least of which because he was insane, and that kind of appealed to me, but also because each week Walter Lantz would explain about how cartoons were made. And I was fascinated. First of all, I always loved, you know, the exhilaration, the exuberant quality to draw an animation. That's still what attracts me the most. And watching Walter Lantz explain how it was done. He did segments on timing. He did segments on using the exposure sheet, segments on, you know, how they cut sound effects in. You know, I mean, this was pretty fascinating stuff. I was like 4 and 5, and I was just soaking it all in. And I got to give my brother Elliot credit. He taught me how to draw Woody Woodpecker when I was 4, you know, and then he eventually gave up drawing, went into newspaper journalism, where he is to this day, and I just continued.
I studied history and theater in school at the New School for Social Research, and you know, you get out of school with tens of thousands of dollars of debt. When you first start looking for work, you're looking, you know, for something exactly what you want. You know, I want to be a theater director. I want to be a theater producer, and as those jobs don't come up, you start saying, well, you know, I guess I could work in film or architecture or something that's kind of like what I want to do. So eventually, after 3 months and bills started to come due, I got a call from an animation studio. It said that we're looking for an assistant. I go into the interview, and it was the Ink Tank, which was in the 80s and 90s, one of the great independent studios in New York. They had offices that were former church architects. So I go into this big vaulted room and sit down, and he offered me the job. And after maybe working there for 2 or 3 months, I realized that, hey, this is better than anything that I thought theater could be. The way an animator approaches their craft in terms of what the gesture is, what the specific look of the piece is going to be, and how to convey information with as great an economy as possible. You know, and the megalomaniacal control that the animator has was really appealing to me. So after after a few months, I said, well, Bob, I'm tired of shuffling papers. I think I'm going to quit if you don't give me a job in production. So I said, oh, okay. And then a couple months later, I was producing a series for Children's Television Workshop with them. So
I was, as long as I've had a memory, I've been interested in animation and have wanted to do it. My mother quotes me at the age of 4 running around saying the word cartoon a lot. I have no idea whether that's a reality or not. It's her memory. So I was actually animating and drawing even before I had a camera that I could shoot it on. So I was making flip books and hiding behind bureaus and trying to entertain my brothers and sisters. Had 2 of each were with me. And they became my staff, actually, doing inking and painting for me when I was younger. When I was 12, I got my first movie camera, a regular 8mm camera. And by the time I was 17, I'd done 2.5 hours of 8mm films in animation. So I was in love with it right from the beginning.
Well, like anybody of the baby boom generation, you grew up, with your aluminum tray table in front of the Emerson console, that smelled of too much lemon pledge, and you had the heavily sweetened cereal dribbling down your chin, and you're watching endless rows of cartoons. I used to get up on Saturday mornings. I think when my parents were still asleep. And like around 6 or something, and I put on the TV, and back then they didn't broadcast 24 hours, so it'd be like gray snow, and then like the Indian head with the little spectrum would come on, and then the weather thing, which looked like it was some weather center somewhere, and then the cartoons would begin from like about 7 a.m., till American Bandstand, till about noon. Then I go out and play, Yeah, well, I guess I always had a love of drawing, and from when I was young, like my father was a naval air fireman. He was one of those guys with the asbestos suits on, with the little window, and they sit around and they wait for jet planes to fall down, which almost never happens. So he spends a lot of time watching TV and roll the hose, unroll the hose, and. But when I was a toddler, I discovered when you took a book off my parents' shelf, the first page or 2 are blank before the print starts. So I started drawing on the insides of books, and my parents were like, "Uh-oh, we've got an artist! Quick, get him some paper before he defaces any more books."
I drew almost all my life since about 2 years old, and I did it for fun. I think the first impression I ever got was Gulliver's Travels, and how I think it was Gabby was in the palm of Gulliver, the giant, and I was amazed by that. Then, of course, I would go to the show, and they'd have these on Saturday. You could see 10 cartoons at a time, and I loved it. And then I think something that really triggered me, and it's funny, it's very mystical. I was with my parents, and I don't know, I was 4 or 5 years old, and we were driving by a drive-in theater, and I had never seen a drive-in theater, and I could see from over the fence, I could see the little window where obviously the projector was, and this golden light coming out, and there was Pluto on a big, massive screen, and I thought to myself, so that's how they do it. And I thought it was a magic light that is projected on a big screen. It never occurred to me that these were drawings. And I always thought, there's something about that magic I still like, that it is magical. I think if you don't do animation, you really have no idea how much energy and soul and heart go into making a film. It's more than pencil against paper. It really is synergy. So then. Later, I thought, I don't know. I knew I was going to go to college, I thought, and I was going to do this and do that. And once I got out of high school, I realized, oh my God, I love art. And I thought I just wanted to be a cartoonist. And then I thought, oh my God, you could actually get an animation. So, when I ended up in Chenard Art Institute, which had had big history for a lot of really wonderful talents coming out of that school and going into the animation, I hate to say industry, but into animation filmmaking. I got very excited because I get to see people. I would hear about these people, see their work on the wall, and thinking, "Oh God, if I could just get there." In fact, I remember once going for an interview when I got out of school at UPA, and I arrived I think my interview was like 9 o'clock in the morning, and I saw these people getting out of the cars at UPA, and they were carrying lunch bags, and paper bags, and they were all going to work, and they were bringing their brown bag in it, and I thought, like the Kill Band cartoon, you don't brown bag, you make animated films, you don't have to bring your lunch in a brown bag, I thought, man, you got it made.